Hello, today we are going to check the Paulsen system, which is knight f3, 6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, and now a6. Well, it's very flexible system, so black is keeping options open, so to say. So most of the time he tries to keep the pawn on d7 for a while, which makes it for white very difficult to find the systems where he can make a long castle, because very often once white is playing knight c3, bishop e3, then black will play bishop b4 and break in the center with d5. So that makes a lot of sense, that because, as I've mentioned already, most dangerous systems for black usually are in Sicilians, in many open Sicilians, are the systems where white makes long castle. Here in Paulsen cannot really manage it, but of course a6 and then followed by very often queen c7 or b5 if white is not playing c4. Of course, it's also black has most of the time a certain issue of development, so white is better developed, and that gives him decent chances for an opening advantage. But all in all, it's a very playable system. There are not so many forced variations, and I will show you now the three major moves: knight c3, bishop d3, and c4. Bishop d3 was always considered to be the most, so to say, annoying for black, just because it's positionally quite difficult. Sometimes white manages to get c4 and then white has more space. But I think I found for you, actually preparing this course, I found a certain idea maybe how black can play to achieve well, quite an interesting and playable position. Then lately, fifth c4 move became very popular. It's quite also a serious weapon. Again, there is nothing dramatic. Black can play, has chances to get a normal position to equalize, but it's maybe now the most popular move against Paulsen system. But let's start with knight c3. Oh, first I want just to mention that in case if white is trying to play g3, bishop g2, which would have make sense, because maybe later he can follow up not with typical knight c3 but with c4 and then knight c3, but that is not working so well, because simply d5 is equalizing immediately, so g3 is not dangerous at all. But lately bishop e2, strange move bishop e2, became quite popular actually, with the idea after knight f6. Of course, white cannot play e5 because of queen a5 check, he's losing a pawn, but now queen d3. This system quite recently started to be popular. I don't really believe it's something very special. Usually black should play queen c7. Here, a typical move in this position. Now the idea is that in case of c4, black has b5 move, because the bishop on c1 is hanging, so you cannot take on b5, and that gives black a good play. Another idea is to play f4, but still b5 followed by bishop b7. I think black is doing fine. Maybe the best try for white is to castle. So white is trying to still to maneuver in a way, yeah, to try to be flexible also. And let's say if black would just play d6 or something like that, then probably white would already put his pawn on c4. And after b5 also, well, one of the most typical moves in Paulsen, then white might get some initiative by playing a4. That's why his knight is still on b1, because b4 comes without a tempi. And now bishop f3, not quite sure if it's anything so special for white, but playable. So, but in my opinion, maybe knight c6 is the most solid move here. Probably white's idea is to take on c6. In case of dc6, knight d2, maybe white can claim a small plus, trying to play a4, knight c4, queen g3. So probably bc6 and now c4. Yeah, kind of playable line. It's just developing now. I mean, I don't know, this position is quite typical. I don't think I would be so worried with black, but it's also playable with white. So bishop e2 system is just developing now. But again, yeah, it's not going to be a refutation of Paulsen, that's clear. And then, so what are the other moves? I think, yeah, let's move to knight c3. In fact, it's not very popular, actually, this move now. But I find it maybe the simplest from the white side. Well, depends on what systems he is playing against some other Sicilians, but I don't see why not actually to play knight c3, because black has normally, of course, he can play knight c6 in this position, which would lead to a system which we are going to study during our next lesson. It's a very serious system, but black probably will get it anyway if he wants. And otherwise, the most typical moves are queen c7 and b5 in this position. But I think in both cases, white has quite simple and pleasant play. So I would seriously consider, for white players, to play knight c3. Only thing that very rarely black is choosing this move order. After knight c3, black can play d6, and it might well be actually the best move in the position. Why it's not so popular? Because, when you are playing Paulsen e6, a6, it means you give a lot of options for white to play fifth c4, fifth bishop d3, very serious moves. So normally you want to play against knight c3 also the Paulsen type of play, but not to move to Scheveningen. But actually with this move order, this Scheveningen is playable for black. Again, of course, you need to know also all those systems. For instance, in case if white plays g4, the play will probably get into to the system which we have checked during the previous lesson, the knight c6, d6, c6. So let's say black can play knight e7 followed by knight bc6, and it will transpose there. Then, for instance, if white is playing bishop d3, then knight f6. That might be quite important that the queen is not yet on c7. I will explain you later why. Because here, with the queen on c7, queen e2 f4 plan was quite dangerous, and we will consider it later now. But here already black maybe can manage without queen c7, playing knight bd7, and after f4, now e5. Becoming quite a serious issue, but then knight c5, so it might be working well for black. Probably the most serious move is bishop e3. Again, now you can play knight c6, knight f6. All this will transpose to different lines of Sicilians, which we will consider. Some of them, like knight c6, we have already checked. Knight f6 we will consider later in a chapter about the Najdorf. Well, black can also maybe try to play b5, even though probably he will put his knight on f6 sooner than later. But there are a lot of small tricky transpositions, so that is why usually, well, you need a lot of knowledge in Sicilian with black to be able to play like this with black. So you are playing Paulsen. Now after knight c3 you are moving to some kind of Najdorf systems. But objectively it's actually a very interesting way of playing, because the most typical moves, queen c7 and b5, frankly I don't see how black equalizes there. For instance, in case of queen c7, now I think the best the point is that now if white is trying to play for long castle this system, of course it already doesn't work, because bishop b4, queen d2, d5, and actually black is even better already. So with this flexible move order, black is avoiding all those systems, quite dangerous systems where white is trying to castle on and start pushing his pawns on the king side. But after bishop d3 I couldn't really find how to proceed with black. I mean, how to equalize, because the most normal move is knight f6 here. Black can play knight c6, but then it would lead to a transposition again to the system which we are going to consider during the next lesson. I call it Rublevsky system because Grandmaster Sergei Rublevsky had played it all his life, and he's the biggest specialist in this system, which is e6, knight c6, a6. But here maybe it's a little bit, it's not the best version for black, because queen is already on c7. And now, yeah, dc6 is really dangerous. White just castles, and after e5 immediately starts to develop his initiative like this, and black is really lacking development and has a very dangerous position. So better to take bc6, and now queen e2, and yes, it's a playable system for black. We will consider it during the next lesson, as I've already mentioned, but I doubt that it's enough to equalize. Black is usually playing bishop b7 and so on, so we will consider it when the time comes. So after bishop d3, well, b5 is a possible move. It would lead to more or less to transpositions after castles to this fifth b5, which we are going to study right now. So, and then knight f6 is a move, and it considers to be, at least it used to consider to be, quite okay for black. But frankly, I don't like queen e2 here move, because if f4 is also playable, but after f4, of course, black can play d6, but maybe b5 can work also, has to be checked. With the idea, in case of e5, black plays b4, might be enough for black to equalize, or at least close to equal. Maybe, but of course the game is very sharp. But the problem, I think, the more of a problem is queen e2 here. So white is just threatening to play e5. Well, what can black do? Probably play d6. There is an option to play bishop d6. A very, well, I don't trust very much such moves. Sometimes it works, but just making use of the fact that white hasn't castled yet, so he cannot play f4. But here, of course, there is nothing wrong with a move like bishop e3, and still black has to prove that his bishop on d6 is fine. Computer is showing even actually quite, computer likes pretty much move rook f1, a strange move, just trying to support f4, but I find it a bit slow. But actually after bishop d6 there is still f4 is still very interesting. I've analyzed it, and quite interesting variations. Okay, definitely black has to take on f4 takes, rook f1, pretty direct play, because if queen goes back then e5 comes, and white definitely has a very big advantage in development, so black's position is quite dangerous. So probably the best is to take on h2, e5, just a line, just to show you. I don't know, it's not really a big theoretical line, it's pretty fresh, but I just got interested analyzing this position. Queen h4 check g3, don't ask me why. Now queen takes d4, ef6 is pretty bad for black. That is quite obvious, yeah, just too much initiative for white. So the best is to take on g3 with check king d2, queen g5 check, king d1, queen g4 now the best move. And for this position, knight e4, only move king d8, and computer, quite strong engine as assassinate, like 0-3 for white. Whatever it means. Probably it means that black is objectively fine, but not to everyone's taste to play with the king on the center and all the pieces undeveloped. So, so after queen e2, normally black is playing d6, and it was supposed to be a playable line, but now again with modern engines they start to be really worried for black after very direct move f4. Probably white just wants to play e5, and after d, fe, knight fd7, bishop f4 is a very dangerous initiative. So knight bd7 is a logical way to stop e5, and now very direct and quick, as you already know from the Keris attack, g4, just trying to put g5. And well, it seems that here, at least according to engines, white is quite considerably better. It gives like 0.6 for white this position. So might be quite, of course, by far not the only way to play with white. Of course, he can play in many different ways, to castle instead of g4, to play slowly. But in any case, it might be a certain problem. I mean, otherwise queen c7 in general would be a very decent move, but I find it quite problematic. So for the black players, I would recommend you, if you want to play this queen c7, then to find something against, first of all, against this system. And for white players, yes, that's maybe the best way to play against queen c7. Otherwise, quite logical also is to play b5 immediately. But again, bishop d3, of course, it's very nice for black to manage b5 in Sicilian. Very often he cannot manage it so easily. But now, if he manages to develop queen c7, knight f6, bishop b7, bishop e7, yeah, he will be doing fine with a pawn already on b5, because white is playing for a short castle already here. But it's not easy to actually to finish development without some damages. For instance, I just give you lines, bishop b7 castle, and now it's getting pretty dangerous for black, actually, if not almost critical in many lines. For instance, if he goes queen c7 now, because knight f6 would be e5, then now rook e1. And how to finish development? I mean, there is this knight d5 typical idea, which is always hanging in the air in this position. And for instance, after bishop d6, again, you see the same idea when white cannot play f4 anymore, so bishop goes to d6 to stop e5 somehow. But now, well, there are more than one good moves for white, but actually a4 is quite strong. And after b4, in fact, immediate knight d5 was also good, but this is even stronger. And knight d5, and white just has a very powerful attack. Well, it's quite logical because he has such a big development advantage. Queen g4, and for instance, this line computer gives already like 1.5 for white. It's a big advantage for white, even though of course he still has to be very accurate, here, but white is better. Or d6, the same problem comes. Rook e1, for instance, preparing knight d5 and just protecting the pawn on e4. Knight f6, and now there is a drawback. Yeah, that's why of the move b5. That's why if you play a6, b5, normally you should try to keep the pawn on d7, because now a4 is very unpleasant. Very typical also plan for this type of positions, especially with the bishop on d3 when the pawn on e4 is protected. Of course, now black can always take b takes a4, but that would weaken his queen side, and white would just be better in this position. So the most principle is b4, and I'm not quite sure that after knight a2 black is able to equalize, but knight d5 is just very strong. Yeah? Again, you see how big is the development problem for black. Yeah? White is already having almost all his pieces into the game, and black still has to develop. That's why such aggressive sacrifices like knight d5 already can work. So now e d5 is simply bad. After e d5 check, okay, of course bishop e7, knight f5 is losing, and after king d7 white can even play slowly like bishop g5 and has a crushing attack here. So the best is to play knight takes d5, e d5, bishop d5, and now c4, bc, bc. Well, these variations with white, you don't even need to remember, because it's quite obvious, that white has a very powerful attack, and that black's position is terribly dangerous. So it just you can play with the hand such moves like knight d5 here. So this, for instance, here queen g4, and the black's position is critical already. So that's why most of the time what black is trying to do is playing queen b6. Well, this idea that, of course, in case of bishop e3, he wants to play bishop c5, attacking the knight, and otherwise at least trying to get the white knight out of the center, and then to continue in the same fashion I'm still not really sure if it's enough to equalize, but that might be playable. First of all, white can play in a very simple positional manner, like knight f3, queen c7, sooner or later will be played, because anyways white at some point wants to play a4, and after b4 that he will have a5 move with a queen on b6 followed by knight a4. So that's why queen c7, castles, bishop b7, rook e1. Again, black has development issues, so now bishop c5, at least trying to develop like this, and even after bishop e3, this position is shouldn't be too bad for black, of course, but still, again, if he manages to develop fully, like, taking on e3, d6, knight f6, knight bd7, he would have a good game, but of course white will do something in the meantime. For instance, as you already know, in case of exchange on e3 and d6, then immediately a4 comes very often. Yeah, white starts to bother on the queen side. So actually knight f3 might also be quite pleasant for white. But the main move is knight b3. Again, queen c7, castles, bishop b7. And yeah, this position is playable. I don't misunderstand me. It's not bad for black, but of course, objectively, it must be comfortable for white. I mean, white has a certain development advantage, and if, I think that there are different ways of playing. Still, I can just show you a couple of lines, just some typical ideas. For instance, if now rook e1, already bishop d6, because the knight is not on f3, so the pawn on h2 is hanging. Maybe bishop d6 is not so bad. Of course, white can just play h3, which maybe black will develop then after h3. But g3 looks logical. And now, for instance, quite a funny line which computer shows. Here is he's playing knight f6, seems to be like a blunder, because white can just take on b5. Of course, in case of AB, knight takes b5 and knight d6 is just losing, and now h5. And all of a sudden, this kind of desperate counterplay, h4, bishop g2, looks like a pawn, but strangely enough, after knight c6, engines are not so pessimistic for black. I mean, believe that black has some play for the pawn. A very strange variation, of course, absolutely not necessary, again, because instead of g3, white has other moves. But still, I believe, of course, white can play f4. It's very plausible. I believe the most, what I would do with white, I would play queen e2. I quite like this, because to overprotect the pawn on e4. Again, knight f6 comes e5. If bishop d6 already doesn't make much sense because of f4. So as usual, d6, yeah, here I guess it will come a4 before knight a2, and then attacking this pawn. Let's say knight c6, bishop d2 looks pretty bad for black. I don't know what to do with the pawn on b4. So queen a2 is, yeah, again asking serious questions to black. Maybe bishop e7 is the best move, just preparing knight f6. But here, something like bishop d2, and white's position is very flexible. He wants sometimes a4 before knight a2, especially if black plays d6. He also might want to play f4, rook a1, and to play on the king side. All in all, it should be playable for black, but you have to be extremely accurate here, because with such a development, one wrong move and you can get crushed. So I believe that actually after knight c3, you saw I gave you a couple of ideas how you can play with black. I mean, to get a playable position, but I believe that knight c3 is a serious system. I would say that it's undeservedly unpopular nowadays. Maybe because white believes that c4 and bishop d3 both are also very interesting, but I think that objectively white has quite good chances to get some advantage after knight c3. But again, it's not a refutation of Paulsen. There is no refutation of Paulsen. And in general, when you are playing the Paulsen system, No, well, you don't fully want to equalize like mathematically, yeah, because in most of the lines black is a little bit worse, but the game is complicated, as I mentioned already, not too many force lines. So black wants just to get a typical Sicilian game, not to allow white to play with a long castle, and then just to play it and try uh, to overplay the opponent in a complicated middle game position, which might objectively be slightly better for white, but all the pieces on the board and very playable. So that is the main idea of players who play Paulsen, and that's why knight c3 with all set, it's it doesn't bother that much black players because they find some way to get a playable position. But again, I quite like knight c3, so my recommendation would be maybe it's the simplest. But also the other moves, c4 and bishop d3, are also very serious, and black has to know, and fortunately after listening to this lesson you will probably know how to play against it, but it's not by no means easy after both those moves. So let's move now finally to bishop d3 move, which is maybe the most popular altogether move, and it's true that it's pretty unpleasant for black, but I think I found a way how to play against it, maybe an interesting try for black, and I'm going to show you right now. Well, after bishop d3, the point is that all those ideas for black to play b5, which were very common after fifth knight c3 already, most of the time do not work, because then white very quickly gets his a4, maybe even here already, and b4 comes without a tempi, so then you will get your knight to c4 probably. So it is clearly premature for black to play like this. So b5 is not a good move. Knight c6 doesn't make much sense because you can take on c6, and dc6 is always slightly worse as long as white has his pawn on c2 and not on c4. And after bc6, well, white at minimum can play knight c3, move to the Rublevsky system, so the main line, but probably he will do something else. He will first castle and maybe make use of the fact that the knight is still on b1, so knight c6 is not a frequent guest in the opening in the grandmaster practice. So d5 is it's playable. It's actually not too bad, but doesn't equalize also, because e takes d5, simply queen takes d5, castles. So it reminds pretty much the French defense, but in those it's usually comes after e4, e6, d4, d5, knight d2, c5, ed, queen d5. So the knight is on d2. Here white will develop with a tempi by playing knight c3, and of course in general the pawn structure is quite solid for black, but he lost some tempis with the queen, and white has a development advantage and definitely has some plus in this position. For instance, in case of bishop d7, just that already now the knight is hanging on d4. Now white can play bishop e3 followed by knight c3. And in case of knight f6, of course, logically knight c3 immediately. Okay, you cannot definitely obviously take on d4 because you're losing the queen. So, and then after queen d8, white has many ways to get at a pleasant position. Rook e1 is not bad. Knight e4 makes sense. Well, it's clear that black still has to finish his development, and in the meantime, white will definitely manage to develop some initiative, and it's pretty sad d5, pretty sad move, not recommended. So then knight f6 is played, or bishop c5. Actually, bishop c5 is very risky. It's quite a risky move, but it's not too bad. I mean, can be played actually. Most of the time white is playing knight b3, and now probably bishop a7. Bishop e7 is played also sometimes, but I'm afraid it's it's pretty dubious, because white has a choice. For instance, he can play just castles, d6, and then put his pawn on c4. Of course, it would have been better for white to have the knight on d4, but even with a knight on b3, it's also now, for example, this plan with f4 followed sometimes by e5 is quite dangerous. So let's say castles, queen e2. This very typical play. E5 is always on the agenda. Queen c7, maybe then bishop d2, rook e1, and this e5 idea is pretty annoying. I mean, not so easy for black to stop it. So that is quite a nice way for white to play after bishop e7, and maybe even more aggressive is knight c3, d6, just to be able to develop, knight f6, and now queen g4. And a typical move. Now there is a certain issue with the g7 pawn after g6, queen e2, and there were many games here, but black's position is very dubious, because once he develops knight f6, bishop h6 comes, and a very dangerous position for black here. So bishop e7 I wouldn't recommend, but bishop a7 is probably playable. Well, the idea is that if now queen g4, then knight f6 is already possible, because after queen takes g7, rook g8, queen h6, there is bishop takes f2 check, for example. So that's why white is playing queen g3 and d6, and this position also things are not so easy still, but it seems to be quite okay for black. So after bishop a7, I think I've played once even like this in classical chess against Peter Leko in Vaikanzea. Made a quick draw, but I didn't like the position I got out of the opening. If I remember well, Peter was just playing in a very normal classical way. He just played at some point c4, knight c3, knight, hard to say whether to put the knight on e7 or f6, but in both cases, maybe king h1, trying to play f4, and sometimes white just plays queen e2, bishop e3 in these positions. But that is not going to be too bad for black, for sure. It's pretty playable. Still probably a bit more comfortable for white, as always in this type of positions, but it's a game. Maybe queen e2 is more dangerous. Knight e7 is usually what is played. Well, you can maybe start with knight c6 just to avoid the e5 idea. Probably it will lead to a similar position, because after knight e7 there is some strange move e5 which computer likes here and finds that white might be slightly better here. But this or that way, white, maybe the simplest for white is to aim for this position, just to change the bishops, castles, takes, and now knight, queen e3, let's say knight c6, knight c3. So to play like this, but it's of course also playable for black. So let's say b5, and now probably long castle. Typical position. It will probably not be so much about mating. It's more a positional play here, and probably the play will develop in the center, because it's very long way for white to push his pawns and to mate on G and H line, and same goes with black. But the game is more developing in a positional manner, like before knight a4, d5, f4. Engine's giving some small plus for white. It's healthy, nice position for a white player. I mean, for a player who enjoys playing Sicilian, it's definitely comfortable for white, but also not too bad for black. So bishop c5, all in all, it's a bit risky system. Of course, you need to know other moves like c3 here also, but it's not too bad. But I believe, the main move is knight f6. Again, using the fact that after e5, of course, there is queen a5 check. So white castles usually. And now queen c7 is the main move in this position, trying to stop e5. If black plays d6 immediately, then white's idea is, that's why he kept his knight on b1, played bishop d3 on move 5, is to get c4, knight c3. And here it's actually just a slightly better version for white than the main line, which we are going to consider next, which is queen c7, queen e2, and then d6. c4, I think queen c7 is for sure necessary move in this position. Queen e2 is not absolutely obligatory. So that's why it's already, if you want to play this pawn structure, then it's already better to start with queen c7. Otherwise, it became quite popular move e5 in this position. I don't quite understand why, actually, because there are quite strong players like Svidler, Caruana, I believe, playing e5. To me, well, it's not too bad probably, but white should be just very comfortable after the simple move knight b3. If knight f3, then knight c6, and black is trying after knight c3, for instance, to play bishop c5, and then d6, h6, to play in this fashion, to develop the bishop on this diagonal. This might be quite acceptable for black. There is an interesting move, bishop g5 here. Well, in case, of course, if ed, then e5. And usually black is playing h6, and also it's a question if after takes knight f5, if black can equalize, g6, usually black is playing, and again trying to put his bishop on this diagonal, but, well, normally same story as very often in Paulsen. If black manages to develop his pieces quietly, he will probably have a decent position, but for the moment, of course, it's well, he has quite a development issue, so maybe in the meantime white will manage to create quite dangerous initiative. So bishop g5 is also a serious move, but in my opinion, I don't know why not to play knight b3, because now d5 is already too much. ed5, knight d5, and let's say queen f3 followed by rook d1. It's clear that black is just, with all the pieces on the 8th rank, black is just not ready yet to open up the position, so d5 is not good. Better probably to play sooner or later it gets to d6, c4, and it will get to this position, bishop e7, knight c3, knight c6, or bishop e6 first. I mean, this type of position, or maybe with a knight on d7, but starting with bishop e6 maybe, and then trying to put the knight on d7. But all in all, probably it is, well, very nice for white. Yeah, white should be slightly better in this position, as I understand, because he has the control on the center. So that is a kind of simple but quite efficient and nice way for white to play, to get some pleasant plus, and then just to play a game. Yeah, so that is at least knight b3 is good enough reason, I believe, for black to to think twice playing e5. That's why queen c7 is the main move, and now queen e2. Of course, the idea is that if c4, knight c6, this is already quite acceptable for black, because let's say this structure, of course, once black will play e5, there will be the weak pawn on d4, weak square on d4, and black's position is already quite acceptable. Another story is if the pawn is on c2, quite often white still is enjoying a pleasant plus, but with a pawn on c4, as here, should be okay for black. That's why after queen c7, again, the idea, if rook e1, then there is always bishop d6 possible, this typical idea. Also, I don't know if after d6, rook on e1 is better than queen on e2, so that's why queen e2 is definitely the main move in this position. d6, what else? e5 is threatening, so d6, and now c4 is what is played, but actually also f4. I believe there is one very important critical position, which is probably the main test for black. If black is okay there, then this line is definitely playable, and after f4, black can also manage to get it. But actually, by far the most popular move here is h4, and it's like almost automatic. Most of the players are playing like this, but actually f4 is very dangerous also, and black really needs to know what to do against it. I believe the best move is knight bd7, because for a long time g6 was considered perfectly fine, and that's why white would not hurry playing f4. because c4 bishop g7 is okay. f5 is also not so dangerous, because I think black can just play bishop g7 and then castle. But computers found a very dangerous way of playing is knight c3, and after bishop g7, e5. Just tactically it seems to work and work pretty well. d5, knight b5. Of course, yeah, it's very difficult to find it on your own, but actually it seems that white is better here. ab, knight takes b5. Of course, if queen b6 or c5 check, white has bishop e3 move. And after queen e7, f5, and there is nothing better for black than to give back the piece by castles, because otherwise, if knight retreats, knight d6 check is coming. So, and this position seems to be, well, quite considerably better for white. a4. The knight is very powerful on b5, and white is just better. So probably g6 is not as good as we thought before, and this is something which only modern engines find, this e5 knight b5 idea. Therefore, what else? Bishop e7, then already c4. You see, in these structures, it's quite important to manage in time g6, bishop g7, because that would give black a very, a couple of extra tempos, because once the bishop is on e7, yeah, then the game develops like this, a very normal way, king h1, let's say, just in case, to avoid all kind of pins on the diagonal. b6, what else black can do? Bishop d2, and now, yeah, with a bishop on e7, there is always this f5 idea, which is quite unpleasant. For instance, after bishop b7, white can play rook e1, but then after g6, maybe it's holdable. The idea is that it's also very typical move, but you see how much better would be to have the bishop on g7, yeah, in this position. Here it might be still okay, because after f5, ef, rook e8, the position is very tensed, but quite unclear, I would say. Black has his counterplay, especially on this diagonal with the bishop on b7, but f5 looks pretty unpleasant here, because now probably e5 has to be played. Knight c5 is not good, because white takes on e6, plays bishop c2, and b4 is a big threat. Actually, pawn on e6 is very weak here. So white is better. Black is not in time really to protect the pawn on e6. So then probably black has to play e5, and then knight b3, and this position is not so simple. Maybe it's not too bad for black, but it's strategically very dangerous, yeah, because this d5 square, I don't like it so much. But that's why maybe rook e8 is, computer shows that this is the most accurate way of playing. In general, again, in this position, if black manages to develop bishop b7 and so on, and white is not breaking quickly in the center, well, black's position is acceptable, even though still white is probably slightly better. But, well, like here, rook e1, you have to be extremely accurate in this position if you are playing it black, not to get under very direct attack, f5 or e5. Here, after bishop b7, well, for instance, yeah, you need to know that it's not easy to find over the board, because it looks like e5 is just crushing here. But in fact, computer finds this incredible tactics, rook d8, and now very direct lines, only moves for black, but this position seems to be okay for black. Black manages to get back the piece and equalize. So you see, this kind of nuances might be very important to start with rook e8. Still, after rook e1, bishop b7, white can, for instance, play knight f3, and this e5 is always hanging in the air, so not so easy to play these positions with black. You have to be, yeah, you have to have an experience here, and have to be extremely accurate, not to get, crushed after e5, because once black plays e5, there is always this d5 square. So it's dangerous position, but again, probably if you analyze it and you find out the best possible move order, maybe you can make it, for black playable. But of course, well, logically, white has a certain space advantage and should be slightly better anyways. But as I mentioned already, it shouldn't worry black. Yeah, it's a different idea playing Paulsen. He wants a complicated game. But I believe, so all in all, I think it's much better if you get the same position, but with g6, bishop g7. Of course, that would be a much better version for black. The question is how. As we know already, starting with g6, then knight c3 and e5. Knight db5 is a problem. So probably then I believe I found the way. I think the best is to start with knight bd7 move. So you need maybe to study it a bit more. I couldn't find any clear advantage for white or something after knight bd7. I think it deserves attention, because if king h1, for instance, again trying to be flexible, so now if g6, already f5 is very strong, so preparing for g6. If bishop e7, then I can already play this type of game, c4. But here the difference is that black can play knight c5, and of course still the position needs to be analyzed, but I couldn't really find after knight c3. I mean, still the issue is that black has to finish his development. I couldn't find any clear way for white to make use of his better development. After bishop e7, for instance, e5 is a very critical move. And now very important move, knight fd7, because if you, of course, it's too dangerous to start with it, because the f line is open, that is not recommended. But after knight fd7, at least modern engines cannot find anything really special for white. It seems that black is in time to finish his development and probably to equalize, for instance. But still, you need to be extremely accurate here with black. For example, f5 looks like a very dangerous move, but playing like this, black is able to equalize according to engines. So king h1, knight c5, that is why we start with knight d7. And in case of c4, here, now already g6. That is the idea. So I really want my bishop on g7. And of course, white can always play knight c3, bishop e3. That is always possible. But I believe that when the bishop is on g7, and especially white's pawn on f4, that is already not so dangerous, because, well, rook c1, b6, for example, b4, a very typical way of playing, knight b3, rook c8. But you see, once it doesn't make so much sense to play both b4 and f4, because in those structures, b4 usually means that white is trying to play on the queen side, and f4 somehow it's more serving the goal of playing on the king side. So it's and here the pawn on e4, unless white is managing e5 or f5, here it's obviously not going to happen. Then the pawn on e4 will be a permanent target and will be a source of black's counterplay. So I believe this position I wouldn't be worried with black here. That's why g6, the critical test is f5. That is, it looks actually quite bad for black, but engines find this now, this amazing way of playing bishop g7, fe, knight e5. Believe it or not, ef7, knight takes f7, just giving up the pawn. But then black wants to play knight g4, castles, and using this e5 square activity of his pieces. Actually, maybe black has enough counterplay for the pawn. At least, again, according to engines, white has a very minimal advantage, like 0-2, and I was checking this position a bit further. It seems that black actually is doing quite okay here. So that might be a very important move order. This is all not really developed theory. This is all something pretty new, what I'm telling you now about bishop d3. So that might be, knight d7 might be a good way to play against f4 and also against c4. Also, most of the time, black is playing g6. That was the kind of idea of black, to get this so-called hedgehog structure with the bishop on g7. But frankly, this position is just strategically very, very difficult for black. I tried to make it work a long time ago. I also used to play Paulsen a bit. and just wanted to get a game with black, but here the position is, I believe, very annoying for black. And I remember I liked very much how Grandmaster Michael Adams was treating these positions with white. Just knight f3, for instance, because now the d6 pawn is becoming pretty weak. So white is already not playing for f3 or f4. He just gets his knight to f3 and starts to attack the pawn on d6, and it doesn't look very nice for black, this position. So knight f3, knight c6, let's say h3, just a useful move. And then white wants to play very often bishop f4, and just, yeah, it's very, very unpleasant position. There were many games, but good players with white, classy players, they were posing lots of problems. For instance, if you play a normal way, pawn on b6, then bishop f4 is not bad, but bishop g5, for example, bishop b7, rook ac1, white wants to play knight d5 often, and it's quite difficult for black actually to manage his pieces somehow. And this knight e5, this pawn structure before, this is always pretty bad, because white has a free play on the queen side. And okay, of course, if the knight gets to d4, it's another story, but it's a long way. Yeah, this knight will not get to d4. So most of the time, black is playing knight d7. But as a type of position, I can just recommend you to study some good games here. It's unpleasant for black. And bishop d2, rook c1, you can even play this. Sooner than later, this pawn on d6 starts to be vulnerable somehow. Probably the most convenient is to play bishop e3. Sometimes people are afraid with white of this structure, but I believe it's also very dangerous for black. Of course, white has this weak c pawns, but he's got two bishops, the king potentially, black's king on g8 is weak, and I don't think it's good enough for black. So bishop e3, and okay, the idea is that, let's say in case of b6, white wants just to play rook c1, and then this knight d5 often becomes a threat. Actually, it's just difficult for black to even to manage to develop normally, yeah, in this position. Also, white sometimes want to play bishop b1 and then queen d2, simply attacking the pawn on d6. If rook d8, often bishop g5 is unpleasant. So somehow I couldn't manage to find the setup for black, a decent setup to develop all the pieces and to get the regular hedgehog structure. For instance, knight d5, rook ac1, and again knight d5 is typically a problem. Sometimes even c5 can be unpleasant. Now, so white is playing clearly on the queen side here, and after bishop d7, white has many options. But for example, already here knight takes e5 is pretty unpleasant, because after d5 there is again tactics knight d5, and in case of ed5 cd5, white is taking back the knight and enjoying a very nice positional initiative. So black is suffering here. So that's why this line, even if it looks perfectly playable, but I can't really recommend you, because if white knows what he is doing, very soon you might experience some concrete problems with the d6 pawn or knight d5, typical tactical ideas. But I found for you, since I'm not playing chess already, so that is all for you, I think that I found an interesting way of playing knight bd7. It's much less popular, but I believe it makes a lot of sense actually to play knight bd7 here. And frankly, yeah, I couldn't really find anything very special for white here. What is the idea? The idea is that, of course, if white plays f4, then black probably has nothing better than to move to this g6 variation, but that we already checked, and it seems to be playable for black. Now, if white is playing knight f3, again, trying to get after g6 to the same position, but here already bishop goes to e7, because with the bishop, black's bishop on e7, the dangerous plan was actually f4, as you remember, king h1, knight c3, bishop d2, rook e1, e5, or f5. Here white already committed his knight to f3, so the pawn is already staying on f2, so you can just play already a regular hedgehog structure, and with a knight on f3, it's already better to have bishop on e7, that your pawn is protected on d6. And I think black is perfectly fine. Then another idea is to play b3 in this position just to stop knight e5, but then you already play g6. So you see it's very subtle, all this move forward. Then g6, and again, now already, let's say knight c3, bishop g7. Actually, it's, I mean, already knight f3, there is some diagonal issue. So this, the most dangerous setup, which is rook d1, knight f3, h3, is already not working so well. Actually, b3 is not needed because sometimes b5 will be a threat, so maybe you will put the bishop on b2, but actually bishop on b2 here is not doing so much. I mean, this position, let's say that is already perfectly okay for black because the pawn on d6 is not under attack. And finally, if white is playing knight c3, well, just a very logical move. So now the point of this knight bd7 is actually to play knight e5 and just to try to take the bishop on d3, because if he retreats then the pawn on c4 is hanging. It's a bit dangerous, for instance, after f4, knight takes d3, queen takes d3, bishop e7. I mean, of course, it's very important bishop, and if black now manages to castle b6, bishop b7, he will have a very perfectly fine position with two bishops. Only that there is still a certain development issue, but neither engine, neither me with engines, in this combination, I was able to find anything very direct for white. I mean, that I don't see how white can make use of his development advantage, and otherwise, if black manages to develop, yeah, I don't see why he would have any particular problems. So that is actually, in my opinion, what after against bishop d3. Finally, of course, it's a very serious system. You can perfectly play it with white. With black, I can recommend you maybe to check this system, bishop c5, bishop a7. It's not bulletproof. I'm not sure it is enough objectively to equalize, but it's definitely playable. And otherwise, well, this, yeah, if you play already knight f6, then I believe that in this position, it's very important to know what I mentioned. After f4, you play knight bd7 and then c4, g6, and then this position is very critical. You can analyze it a bit further, but I believe it's definitely playable. Or in case of c4, also very important that you start with knight bd7, in my opinion. And then again, if knight c3, knight e5. And this position, in my opinion, is also quite playable for black. So all in all, I think against bishop d3, well, we have a nice situation for both players, for both sides. So with white, not many people know about this knight bd7, early knight bd7 move further, and otherwise you have a good chance to be better. And even after knight bd7, you still have chances for some slight opening advantage. And for black, at least maybe the most unpleasant, which is considered to be the most unpleasant system, bishop d3, at least, yeah, you have a weapon with this early knight bd7, you can definitely play with black like this. So bishop d3, I think now with this I will finish bishop d3 and move to the fifth c4. And finally, fifth c4 move. Very popular nowadays. I've played it myself once or twice with black, but mainly with white, with good results. I've analyzed it a lot, and without false modesty, I would say that I've developed in some variations, developed the theory there. So especially in knight f6, knight c3, bishop b4 variation. It represents quite a dilemma for black. So black can try to play in a very principled, straightforward way, but then knight f6 has to be played anyway, knight c3, and now there is a choice between queen c7 or bishop b4. Bishop b4, let's start with this move. It's very direct, and it was supposed to work pretty well, but then this queen d3 move, which I developed on the top level for the first time, I think played it against Vasily Ivanchuk in Monaco blindfold actually game, and that now represents quite of a problem for black, because even if he maybe objectively manages to finally make a draw at the end of the day, but he's suffering. It's not completely equal, and black doesn't seem to have any realistic winning chances after queen d3 if the opponent knows the theory. But otherwise, if he doesn't play bishop b4, there is another option to play queen c7. I played it myself actually in classical chess against Garry Kasparov in 2001. That is playable definitely for black, but probably, well, objectively white keeps a certain advantage in this position. So it's a difficult choice for black, whether you really want to equalize, because c4 is a dangerous line, so you want maybe to illuminate it somehow as black, not to give white chance to build up this hedgehog structure in a classical way, and to be slightly better in a complicated position. But then you have to suffer probably a bit and try just to make a draw. Let's move to variations. Bishop b4. Well, now e5 doesn't work so well. After knight e4, black is doing fine, so that is not a problem. Bishop d3 actually makes some sense. Knight c6, that was always the main line, and here knight takes c6 is a very important line which you need to know if you play with black. This variation with bishop b4 takes e5, and now queen a5, otherwise black is just worse. But here, using this tactical motive, takes bishop d2, queen takes d3, fg, rook g8. This position is critical. It is somewhat dangerous for black, but at the end of the day, black seems to equalize. Here I analyzed it a lot, was trying to find something for white, but couldn't really manage. I think even if it looks scary, but don't worry, I think black actually manages to hold it. So very important variation. But knight c2, maybe what I can recommend you for white, to analyze knight c2 move. It's not very common, but it's not so easy maybe. Bishop takes c3, check, b takes c3. Now d6 is logical, but then you have certain issue with the pawn. Bishop a3 comes very quickly. I'm not quite sure if white can manage to put very serious pressure on the d6 pawn, but it might be a bit uncomfortable. At least visually looks a little uncomfortable. You need to know exactly with black how to proceed in this position. But maybe d5 is equalizing actually, but still white might try to get a little something here after ed5, and let's say if queen e2 check, bishop e6. So according to engines, black is very close to equalize, but a little bit more comfortable for white because of two bishops. But you need to, I mean, you can play it with white also, I believe. But there is nothing wrong with queen d3, which is now probably the main line, and it's quite difficult to find a playable position for black here, because if he tries to play, for example, if he just castle, then e5 comes, and that is very unpleasant. Knight e8, a3. Now, of course, exchanging on c3 would just give two bishops and very easy, comfortable plus for white. Queen a5 looks like a clever trick, but it doesn't work, because after ab, queen a1, knight b3, the queen is trapped. So probably black should just come back to e7, and now white has many ways. For instance, simple bishop e2 followed by castle, and white will definitely end up with some advantage out of the opening, so this is not recommended. Queen c7 is another move here, but here again some tactics. a3 is very unpleasant, because okay, if you go back with a bishop, then why bishop b4 was played? So the idea is that, but to take on c3, of course, but now queen takes c3 works. And of course, if you just play d6, white is playing f3, and he will just get again two bishops and nice plus. And knight takes c4, in fact, it's just practically losing because of knight b5. This very important tactics, and ab queen takes g7, very direct play, rook f8, bishop h6, queen c5, and now f3, and this position is actually just bad for black. Very important variation to know, otherwise queen c7 would have been a playable move. So then what else? Knight c6 is another way of playing, and this is what, by the way, was played in the World Championship match in Sochi. Carlsen Anand, this famous game, which was won by Carlsen, but on the way he actually made a big blunder, and Anand could have just won a pawn and probably the game with this pawn. But opening wise, I think white was better. Takes, queen d8, king d8, e5. Oh yeah, so here the lines are very important, very direct and very important to know moves. So everything works tactically for white. So e5, because knight e4 looks like what's black's problem, but a3 now. a3 is very strong. And now in case of bishop a5, there is b4, and this position is pretty bad for black because of his awful bishop on c8. Or bishop takes c3 check, b takes c3, knight takes c3, a4, and to start with, black has serious issues with his knight, so he has to be careful not to lose the knight, but in any case he has very bad black squares and very passive bishop on c8, so this position is not playable, it's just much better for white. Therefore, knight d7 has to be played. That was played in this game. Carlsen Anand, bishop f4, at least to double the pawns, because otherwise white would just castle, play knight e4, and have a serious advantage due to this d6 square. bc, king c7, and I actually asked Wish later why he went for this very unpleasant endgame, and he said that they consider that it's like almost a fortress, that there are good drawing chances, but frankly, I don't believe. I think white is experiencing just a very nice advantage. h4, it's a very good idea to start pushing pawn. h6, just to avoid white playing h6 himself, and now rook h3. The nice maneuver, another one, rook goes to d1, rook g3, so black is extremely passive. True that it's difficult to win with white this position, but it's really one-sided game, and I would definitely not play this variation with black. It's just suffering for the rest of the game and trying to make a draw miraculously. So no, this is really not the Sicilian way of playing. So then what is left? There are not so many decent moves left, finally. Well, what else? There is d6 also here. On top of everything, white can also just play knight c2, which is also unpleasant, because if takes, again, you cannot take the pawn on e4, and you just gave up to bishops, and probably white, after castles, can play bishop d3 or f3. Well, with two bishops, it will be just very comfortable for white. So you see not so many moves left. Then d5, what else? d5, and now the game also gets quite direct. Takes, bishop e2. You can start with knight c6, but it doesn't matter. It leads to the same position. Castles. Now knight c6. Well, I think in this game, which I played against Ivanchuk, he took on c4, queen c4, and played bishop d6, but actually after rook d1, white is just better, because there is a symmetrical pawn structure, but you see how big is the difference in activity of pieces, and actually I managed to win the game very quickly here, so this is not recommended. Then there is nothing better than playing knight c6, and I think I played once against Van Veli. If I remember correctly, I took and played bishop g5, but that was not really enough for any advantage. He managed to make a draw here. So the best way is c takes d5. Here, for knight takes d5, knight takes c6, bc6, knight takes d5. In case of cd5, bishop e3, this position is very unpleasant. Bishop gets to d4, and with queens on the board, black is really suffering for the rest of the game, so this is just worse. That's why queen takes d5 should be played. And after queen takes d5, cd5, bishop e3, it's actually still, this endgame is slightly better for white, but there were many games. Very important move, I believe, is a5 to try to push the pawn to a4. Black still has to be accurate, but it seems that just by tempi he manages to make a draw in this position. So maybe white's best try here is just to play queen g3. And I analyze this position again. Yes, probably with a very, very precise, accurate defense. At the end of the day, black manages to hold this position. But it's clear that, well, first of all, zero winning chances. And secondly, yeah, with this in a symmetrical position, just that black has some weaknesses. So all in all, the position, unless you analyze it for hours and manage to find the best possible defense, it's not really pleasant to play with black because of these weak pawns. So after bishop b4, queen d3 represents, as I understand nowadays, is quite a serious danger for black. I don't see anything really better. So whether you end up just slightly worse, giving up the bishop on b4 in those variations like d6, whether you are playing d5 or various types of slightly worse positions where you have zero winning chances and just fighting for a draw. So that's why maybe for most of players who are not playing world championship matches, so you just want at the end of the day enjoy chess and you play Sicilian and the Paulsen system in order to get a complicated game. So then maybe I would recommend you in this case to play queen c7. Even though still for white, it's white has definitely chances to get a certain opening advantage here. So after queen c7, I think a3 here looks a bit slow, but it's pretty important to stop bishop b4. It's a very useful move. Otherwise, maybe if bishop d3, then knight c6 already. You see this typical idea because now the knight on d4 is hanging. And after knight f3, for instance, bishop c5, very important that bishop gets to this diagonal. Then followed by d6, h6, castles. This position should be perfectly fine for black, perfectly playable. So that shouldn't represent much danger, bishop d3. Bishop e2 is quite serious. It needs to be analyzed because now in case of knight c6 you can simply castle, there is no threat. So that's why bishop e2, bishop b4 is a move. And now there is a move queen d3 here, but I think black is doing fine there after queen d3. The most principle is castle here, just to sacrifice a pawn. And in case if black also castles, then white has an interesting idea to play bishop g5 here. And after bishop takes e3, bishop takes f6. Intermediate move. And in case if bishop goes back, probably bishop g5, white can be probably slightly better. And let's say after bishop takes b2, white has queen d2 move, for instance, or rook b1 maybe also, but queen d2 especially. Now, of course, you cannot take because you will get mated. So probably gf6 and queen takes b2. And here, this position is not totally clear, but white has quite dangerous initiative for the pawn. Clearly has enough compensation, but maybe it's also playable for black. So this castle bishop g5 might be interesting with the idea bishop takes c3, bishop takes f6. But maybe black can just take the pawn. Actually takes, and also d6 might be perfectly playable against trying to go knight bd7. I just don't know this type of position. Let's say if white even just plays f3 and then proceeds in this position. Of course, he has weaknesses, but from other point of view, a space and two bishops. So you might consider playing this position. It's pretty strange, difficult to assess, but white has chances at the end of the day to get an advantage. But actually I'm not sure that you cannot simply take on f4. Bishop f3 is maybe the best move, and now knight c5. And let's say knight b3, d6, there are some lines. I think at least with the help of engine, black is somehow most of the time, I mean, I think in every line manages to hold here. So bishop e2 is an interesting move to analyze. For white is a very, very principal move, but probably if black knows how to play against it, it will manage to get to equalize. So a3. Here, yes, here there is no real way for black to avoid this typical long, maneuvering hedgehog type of position after a3, because there is some tactics, knight takes e4, sudden move, knight takes e4, knight takes e4, queen e5. Actually, black manages to get back the piece, but his position is pretty bad. I mean, bishop d3 is the simplest, queen takes d4 castles, and here black is just has no development for this small pawn, and his position is pretty bad. Engines, modern engines are given already more than +1 here. Bishop e3, queen takes b2, knight g3, and then very soon white starts to sacrifice and crush black's position. So that is definitely not recommended. Then what else? Moves like bishop c5, then bishop e3, let's say castle, and then white just develops in a normal way, always useful to play b4, queen d2, then let's say e5, white just wants to play rook c1, castles, knight b3, so black doesn't really manage to bother white c4 pawn or to get d5, so finally, let's say, white with a simple moves like this gets a very nice, comfortable plus, so also don't really see why to play bishop c5. It leads to a quite unpleasant position. Same goes knight c6. I mean, it might lead to transpositions, but again, after bishop e3, seems that white has everything under control, so black cannot manage to attack something, and we will end up in this hedgehog position. Pawn structure. So then the best is to play b6. That's what I played also against Garry Kasparov in this game in 2001. I just wanted to get the typical structure and just to play a game. Here bishop e3 is the main move. In fact, for white players, yeah, I would attract your attention that maybe f4, which is not often played, but it's quite interesting. It's more aggressive way of playing. It's already a different plan. So white just wants to play bishop d3, then followed by, let's say, d6, queen e2, and then again the same type of play, sometimes e5, so playing more aggressively. Actually quite interesting to play like this, needs to be checked further. On knight c6, let's say you take, you play queen e2, bishop c5, bishop e3, different type of play, probably also slightly better for white, but playable for black as well. But most of the time white just plays bishop e3, bishop b7, f3, and white starts to build up the typical, his typical plan in those pawn structures. Bishop e7. Now there are a lot of different move orders. So, for instance, white can, for the moment, delay bishop e2 and start with queen d2, castles, rook c1. It's pretty much all about black playing knight c6 here. So here, knight c6, there is always a very typical idea of playing knight a4 against knight c6, just trying to bother quickly the pawn on b6. So you have to be careful here. I mean, always be aware that once you play knight c6, you have to check knight a4. So white can also try to play knight d5, another typical tactics, but maybe here takes g6. In this particular position, maybe it's not really enough for anything special, and black will manage to equalize at the end of the day, because white still needs, to spend some tempis finishing his development. So again, a lot of tricky move orders like this you need to investigate. Of course, with black you can always play d6 here, but I will explain you later why I believe maybe knight c6 is a better plan. So usually white starts with bishop e2, this or that way castles, let's say rook c1 first. So now there are two different plans. In this game, I decided to play just a very classical plan with d6, knight bd7. By the way, you need to check how Kasparov played in this game. I think he played extremely well. He knew exactly the plan, and I was in quite serious trouble pretty soon. I managed to make a draw, even almost won at the end this game, but I was really worse. So a very classical game from the white side, how to play this type of positions. But that is all connected with castles. He was just playing for castles. But actually nowadays engines are brave enough just to start pushing pawns in this position, leaving the king in the center, and actually it's quite dangerous plan also. You need to be ready if you are playing black also. I mean, you need to know what to do against this plan of just pushing the pawns. Not even so much in the sense of mating. Of course, you'll not mate. It's more just to get some more space, and especially having this g5 in mind all the time, that you kind of stop d5, yeah, because d5 always g5 comes. So very interesting plan as well, but castle is probably good enough. Also, of course, white is more comfortable here, has more space, but again, it's a typical complicated position, and of course the play goes for 3 results. Black has his own chances in this type of positions, but objectively, well, white must have some plus in this here. And here I played in this kind of classical way, rook c8, queen b8, and then I even started this maneuver bishop d8, bishop c7, which was not very fortunate. But all in all, I think that probably the best setup, finally I decided after this game that probably the better setup for black is to put rooks here, one rook on c8, let's say another queen goes to d8, and another rook to b8. I thought that was, and queen, let's say, going somewhere to f8, and it's not so easy to progress here with white because there is always d5 on the agenda, sometimes b5, but of course black is somewhat passive, but that is the typical play in this structure. So black stays not doing much, but once white starts to do something, starts to play active moves, then black can counter strike. Yeah, so it's still, I mean, it's definitely playable d6, but again, for sure, objectively, it's not completely equal. White has some advantage here. So maybe knight c6 makes sense, but again, here you need to know exactly what you are doing, because this knight, for example, knight a4 is quite dangerous, just attacking the pawn on b6, rook b8, protecting it, and after b4, now white wants, I guess, to create very quick his play with maybe knight b3 and even c5 to start, playing on the queen side. And now engines, for instance, give very much like in this position to start some counterplay with knight h5, trying to get knight f4, and maybe it's playable for black. If b4, also very typical plan here, b4, knight b3, and then maybe c5 or b5, start to push pawns here. In this particular position, probably after a5, knight b5, queen b8, and the pawns will be exchanged, pawn b6 and pawn b4, and maybe white still keeps a bit of initiative, but shouldn't be enough for any real advantage. So probably white's best is maybe just to play queen d2 here, and again, many options here, many possible options. Well, at minimum, what black can do is just to exchange one knight, play d6, and get this typical structure. Then you play rook e8, rook c8, maybe knight d7, bishop f8. It's a game, it's a complicated game, but for sure, well, white is comfortable and, yeah, definitely enjoying himself in this position. But again, you need to know exactly how to play this type of position. It's a special story. It's a kind of complicated position. You need to know typical plans. But all in all, I think that c4 is maybe, it's quite simple for white to play. That is maybe a reason why the c4 move is the most popular nowadays. Because it's quite simple. So whether you play after c4, you play this queen d3 on knight f6, bishop b4, and then black is just suffering trying to make a draw in a slightly worse position, whether you immediately get this hedgehog structure with a3, bishop e3, f3, and you play a slightly better complicated position. So also, well, I can recommend actually for white all three moves: knight c3, bishop d3, c4. Each of it move has its own advantage, so it's really a matter of taste. So to summarize the Paulsen system, of course, it will not cause white a problem. As you see, white has quite a number of interesting options, and in general, it doesn't fully equalize, frankly, for black. But if you know, you need to be careful with black, because quite often there is a certain development issue. But you know, actually it's playable. Yeah, you can always get a playable position with black here. So if you just want to play a game complicated with a lot of pieces on the board and a playable position and trying to outplay your opponent in the middle game, then Paulsen is definitely a possible option. As to white players, yeah, choose what you like more. c4, knight c3, bishop d3. I think all those moves gives a good chance to get a slight opening advantage, especially after listening to this lesson. So for sure, you will not stop playing Sicilian because of the Paulsen. So that's about the a6 for today, and the next lesson will be knight c6 instead of knight c6, knight c3, a6. And as all other moves than knight c3, which is also quite a big part of the theory. So-called Rublevsky system, e6, knight c6, a6. For the moment, I think that we are done with the Paulsen, and time to move to Rublevsky system, and then the main one after knight f3, e6, which is Taimanov system, which is quite a big theory and will probably take me 2 lessons to explain. So okay, for today, I think both sides can be happy. You can play it with both colors, the Paulsen system. Probably at the end of the opening, if your opponent is well prepared, you will end up slightly worse with black, but you can still win games there and you will get a complicated playable position.